I've been around the competitive Pokemon scene since Generation 4, and yet I've never really thought about item clause in relation to it because it's never been enforced. It's not a part of Smokin' tournaments, of course, or the ladder or whatever, but even in more casual levels of play, which is where you learn about item clause to begin with. Like for me, that was the Gen 4 Wi-Fi days. Then people would mention sleep clause, OHKO clause, evasion clause, species clause. Yeah, all that is great. And they would also sometimes mention item clause, but it would never actually be enforced. So it's not something I have any experience with. I don't think many people have much experience with singles, at least 6v6 singles. I don't know how Battle Spot 3v3 or whatever that is handles it. I assume if it's Nintendo endorsed, I assume they have some form of item clause in play. But yeah, so much of what competitive singles is revolves around being able to use the same of one item on multiple Pokemon. And it's not just stacking leftovers. Items were introduced in Gen 2 and leftovers were clearly the best item, so pretty much everything is going to run lefties, with the exception of Marowak, which runs Thick Club, and, sometimes you'll see like a Miracle Berry somewhere. Or more commonly, you'll see an itemless Pokemon using Thief to steal leftovers from something else. But yeah, it's not just about stacking leftovers. There's all sorts of things you can do. In later generations, then you have things like multiple choice banders being very possible, or choice specs users, Gen 4 and on, or even choice scarfers sometimes. You have offensive teams that stack up on Lumberries so they don't get slowed down by status. Life Orb, of course. You sometimes even see Resist Berries getting stacked up on if there's a major threat that you have to take away opportunities from. There are even offensive teams that love stacking Custat Berry, for example. So it's very difficult for me to imagine what item clause would be like, because I think the later you go on in the generations, then the less you shake things up, just because of how many great item options there are, like with Toxic Orb becoming a thing, and then like Rocky Helmet and Assault Vest. Then you have more options for good items than ever before, so you're not necessarily beholden to just, lefties or inferior options. And something like GSC would be completely ruined by it, because there's not enough bulk outside of, Snorlax and then, Blissey stuff. And when only one Pokemon gets to hold lefties, then you're going to struggle to withstand opposing offense. I don't know, that's off the top of my head. Again, it's really difficult to conceive of. But I don't know that I like the idea of item clause. And I never really heard anyone talk about it, but I think with Generation 8 and Heavy Duty Boots really leaving a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, then there's been more thought about it, because a lot of people said, limit boots to one per team, and then you realize, that's kind of like item clause. And item clause in general, I mean, I don't know, I think it would definitely make the game more offensive, which I guess people like, because the item clause thing comes from people who are comparing it to VGC, which does have item clause. I mean, putting aside the fact that it's doubles and 4v4 and all that stuff, then yeah, okay, I get it. But it also makes the game a lot more offensive in singles, because now you can't stack lefties on everything. Not that there aren't other options to get around that, of course. Poison types, they have that little loophole, because you run lefties on something, and then you run Black Sludge on the poison type, so like Toxapex being the obvious example, and then you can also get your passive recovery through Toxic Orb Poison Heal. So if you take a fairly standard trio in Sun and Moon of Black Sludge Toxapex, Leftovers Magearna, and Poison Heal Gliscor, then you have these three passive recovery Pokemon that are then that are not breaking item clause. And then you throw in other things like Regenerator, and you've got like a Rocky Helmet, Tangrowth. I'm just going off this team of Finchinators that I used to use. You got a Rocky Helmet, Tangrowth, and then Flyinium Z, Tornadus Therian. And I mean, you throw in Mega Stones as well, and the last Pokemon on that team is a Mega Lopunny. and that team, doesn't even try, and it fulfills item clause. So yeah, the more modern or current the generation with more and more options, then yeah, they would be a lot better. But even something as relatively modern in my eyes anyway as Gen 4 in terms of mechanics and everything, then yeah, even that would have a really difficult time with item clause if you wanted to run defense, because you don't have these huge regenerator Pokemon. That's a really big factor. And I mean, even in Black and White, then you have your Rocky helmets and so on there. But if you're talking about Rocky Helmet and Poison Heal and Regenerator, Magic Guard, which makes it easier to not run lefties, but you still really want to run lefties. So I'm generally not a fan of things that limit your ability to take on big threats in the game, because I think that's what a lot of competitive Pokemon's problems come from. When you have a game element, and this is why I've made these videos on why switch moves, maybe they're broken, or entry hazards or trapping, because they're really, and even in my last video, I think, or no, the one about Ojama and McMegan playing by their own rules in tournament finals tiebreak, even in that, then it really it came back to the power of spikes, which they agreed to play without. And like, while I disagree with the way that game took place, then I understand the frustration behind a game element being so powerful that if you want to be using the best thing possible, which is what being competitive is all about, then it can be frustrating to constantly have to go back to it, or be worse off for it, and constantly having to play around it. And that's when you start questioning where the balance of playing for competition and for fun is. So yeah, and so in a fun sense, yes, okay, I get it. For sure, because the game gets more offensive on average. I like take that Sun and Moon team, which is still quite bulky, and has no problem with item clause. But yeah, I don't like how, like, I'll even use the odd example of a double choice scarf setup, because that's an unusual unusual pairing to have on a team, two scarfers, and you can't do it without drawback. But the benefit is that you wind up being really solid into offensive teams that are otherwise difficult to deal with. And putting a restriction on that is just something I don't care for. I mean, it's so hard for me to conceive. I don't even know how far I would go with it. People would say, "Oh, well, it makes the game more balanced because you can't spam healing." It's like, well, doesn't that just make it harder to deal with offensive Pokemon that are already harder to deal with? That's always my number one concern with stuff that regards to tiering. Because, I mean, I don't think that the game is... Okay, actually, I don't know much about game balance, so I won't go that far. But I think it's telling that generation after generation, there are Pokemon that are so dangerous and have such limited ways of being dealt with. And since the community, contrary to popular belief, actually has a violent aversion to banning things. And from what I've heard from people who play other games, is that a lot of other games have zero problem just stripping the game down to the bare bones in order to create the most competitive environment. To paraphrase Heist almost exactly. And in Pokemon, we don't like doing that. We're like, oh no, I want to play with as many Pokemon as possible. Which, I mean, this goes back to another sentiment I often have, and something I want to make a video about how we have competitive Pokemon, but we don't, or we say it's competitive, but we often make a lot of choices that are not competitive for the sake of convenience or subjective fun or whatever. Because some people have fun using defensive teams, not like hardcore PP stall over 700 turns, but that like Finch team, for example, it's defensive, but I think it's really good, and it's not like passive or lazy or anything. You have to be good to win with that team. It's not going to do the job for you, unless your opponent's team is bad, of course. And I get it to the degree that the game can be limiting sometimes, but I don't know if item clause is the way to fix it. You're just gonna because I've played a lot of metagames where there's so many difficult Pokemon to take on. And the best way to slow down something crazy might be to slap a couple assault vests or rocky helmets on your team. And not even being able to do that, I mean, that's just. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like the benefit is to make the game more offensive and faster paced and more fun. And I guess if you value that more than the competitive factor, then okay, sure. But that's why tiering is not supposed to be subjective. Because fun is one of the most subjective things there is, whereas you can make actual competitively minded arguments. So I'm interested in what competitive arguments there are for item clause, because I can't really think of any. But then again, it's not really my field. So thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting for you. I hope you enjoyed this little YouTube short, and I will see you tomorrow.